last time we were going over some notes, we had talked about circulation of the blood through the circulatory system. Let's just think back to that for a second. Where does deoxygenated blood return to the heart? Which chamber, I guess? Which chamber of the heart does deoxygenated blood return to?
The right atrium.
The right atrium. Which blood vessels carry that blood from the various parts of the body to that right atrium? Two main blood vessels, one coming from the upper parts of the body, one coming from the lower parts of the body. It has a special name. Remember what it was? Called the vena cava, the superior coming from the upper body, inferior coming from the lower parts of the body, emptying into the right atrium. From the right atrium, it goes into the
Left atrium. Right ventricle.
right ventricle, down into the right ventricle. This blood that came from all the parts of the body, where does it need to go next in the pattern, Bishop? It needs to go to the lungs. So it gets pumped out of the heart through the right ventricle, through the pulmonary arteries, going out to the lungs. Tell me what happens to that blood when it gets to the lungs. CO2 diffuses out, oxygen diffuses in. Where's that blood headed next after it's recharged in the lungs? Where is it going? Well, before that, this guy goes back to the heart, but which chamber? I hear rights, I hear lefts. Which? Left.
Ventricle.
Atrium. Atrium is an entryway. Comes into the left atrium. Pumped through a valve into the left ventricle. Then it gets pumped out. What's the main blood vessel it travels through? Yeah, there's a specific name for this one that leaves the left ventricle. It is part of systemic circulation. It's the aorta. And the aorta branches off, leading to all the different parts of the body, and then we start our circulation again. All right, so these blood vessels that carry that blood, kind of we split them into three categories. Okay, start with talking about arteries. So arteries are the blood vessels that take the blood away from the heart. They carry blood away from the heart. Now, typically, most of the blood leaving the heart is oxygenated. But there's an exception, and that's the pulmonary artery. That's an artery that's taking blood away from the heart, but that blood is deoxygenated. Because where is it headed? To the lungs. Oftentimes, our arteries are deeper in our body. Damage to an artery could be serious because the arteries have higher pressure. Okay, they can bleed, like if you see in movies and stuff. If somebody gets an injury and blood is spurting out, it's an injury to an artery. Because every time their heart beats, pressure increases and blood spurts out of that injury. They're pretty strong and elastic. They're stretchy. They are muscular. They have these layers of muscle and tissue that make up the arteries. Inside, they're typically smooth, normal arteries, but they can become narrowed by the buildup of deposits in those arteries. Okay? Here you see an example of that. Also, the swelling of the artery, weakening of that artery as it stretches, could cause a disease called aneurysm. They're made of smooth muscle, and they have thick walls, which makes them pretty durable. So, if we look at sort of major arteries of the body, so we have our heart. Now this is the aorta. Okay, it comes out. Where's the blood coming that's entering this part? Coming from?
Ventricle.
Left ventricle. The first two branches off the aorta are these coronary arteries. Remember I showed you that model of heart? Those are the arteries that feed the heart muscle itself. Okay. Then, as the aorta makes this arch, okay, there are several branches. The brachiocephalic arteries, okay, branch off. One leads down the right arm, the subclavian artery, comes out of your body, goes like underneath sort of your collarbone area, then loops down to your right arm. There's also one on the left side, same thing, loops around down your left arm. We have two carotid arteries that come up through our neck, one feeding sort of the right side of the head and one feeding the left side of the head. You can see those arteries here. And then we know the aorta loops back below the heart and then branches off, feeding blood to all the other parts of the body. Okay, these iliac arteries branch off and go down, one down each leg, and so forth. When you can feel your pulse, what you're feeling is you're touching an artery. Okay, there's an artery there, and each time your heart beats, it expands, and you can feel that beating of the heart. Bringing blood back to the heart are veins. So veins bring the blood back to the heart. Typically they carry deoxygenated blood, but there's an exception. Which vein would be carrying oxygenated blood? Pulmonary vein, because it's bringing the blood back to the heart from the lung. Veins are often found closer to the surface of our skin. There are some deeper ones as well. They have structures a little bit different than arteries. They are also made of smooth muscle, but they're much thinner, not as elastic. They don't have to withstand as high pressure because by the time the blood makes its way into the veins, the pressure is lower. But because of that, they have a structure inside of them that's important. They have these little valves inside, these little one-way doors. And that's to make sure blood only travels through them in the proper direction. Now, the arteries don't really need valves because the high pressure is forcing blood only one way. But in the veins, the pressure is much lower. And so there would be the possibility that blood could go backwards. But it's stopped because of these valves that allow it only to travel in one direction. Sometimes those valves break down and don't function properly, and people develop, it's called varicose veins, where the normal vein, those valves prevent blood from going backwards. But if those valves break down, blood can go backwards and start to sort of pool in these veins, and then they become swollen and so forth. They bulge. Often happens as people get older as well. And then connecting the two, connecting arteries to veins, are the capillaries. Capillaries are sort of the very thin, very narrow connections between arteries and veins that sort of surround all of our body's tissues. So they carry both oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So you can see blood coming from the heart is branched off to form these small arterioles. They get small enough, these are the capillary networks, we call them. Very, very thin. And as blood goes through those capillary networks, it gives up the material it has, and then they start to merge back together to form veins, which eventually will bring that blood back to the heart. So the capillaries connect the two. Okay, they surround basically all of our cells, all of our tissue. They're very, very thin. They're made of just a single cell thick. And again, that's important because material is going to be diffusing into and out of these capillaries. So they're very thin. Sometimes if these capillaries are damaged, that's what can lead to bruising, okay, sort of bleeding underneath the skin. Okay. Excess blood glucose, too. A person has diabetes can damage those capillaries. That's why it's important to manage blood glucose levels appropriately. And so what happens is once the blood reaches these capillaries, okay, materials are exchanged. Okay? So there's blood coming into the capillary, gives up oxygen, gives up nutrients. Same time, it receives carbon dioxide from the cells in the tissue, receives waste products to be carried back to the heart. Megan, what was your question?
So, bruising is kind of low-key internal bleeding?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Here's just another diagram of a capillary bed. This would be, could be supplying muscle or the brain or any other tissue. So blood coming in, it's under higher pressure from the arteries. Forms these very narrow capillaries. In the capillaries, the blood cells basically have to move single file. That's how narrow they are. And as blood enters these capillary networks, material from the blood, nutrients, oxygen can diffuse through this fluid that surrounds all of our tissue and then reach the cells. At the same time, the cells can give up their waste products, which can be put into circulation, and then sent off to be removed by the excretory system. So this is a capillary network. So in humans, heart disease or coronary disease or diseases of the circulatory system are one of the most common types of health problems people have, especially as they get older. Some examples: high blood pressure, hypertension. When the pressure, this is the most common cardiovascular disease, when pressure in the blood vessels is higher than it should be. And elevated blood pressure can cause damage to the heart muscle, can cause damage to the arteries. High blood pressure is caused by lots of factors. Could be caused by stress, poor diet, smoking increases chances of high blood pressure. People develop high blood pressure as they get older. Sometimes people are just inherit a tendency for high blood pressure. Even if they were doing all of the other things correctly, they could have high blood pressure. I used to know a teacher that worked here, and he just had sort of genetic high blood pressure. He would eat super healthy and very low cholesterol and so forth, and exercise all the time, but still at very high blood pressure. So that's just something that person inherits sometimes. Atherosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries due to the buildup of plaques and cholesterol in the walls of the artery. Okay, some foods that are high in cholesterol, that cholesterol can build up on the insides of arteries, kind of start to clog them up. And obviously, as they become more narrow, it's harder for blood to flow through them, harder to supply tissues with oxygen and nutrients, and can lead to problems. A heart attack is when there's a loss of blood flow to those coronary arteries for some reason. Okay? And the heart muscle itself is not receiving oxygen, and therefore the muscle can be damaged. It could be caused by a blockage, like a blood clot that goes to the coronary artery. It could also be caused by a narrowing of the coronary arteries due to the buildup of plaques and cholesterols and so forth. And so, you know, some of the telltale symptoms are chest pain, arm pain in the arm and shoulder, things like that. Sometimes there are signals that a person could be having issues with their heart. Some people have their blood is unable to carry enough oxygen. Okay, that's called anemia. Could be sometimes due to lack of iron in their diet. Remember, red blood cells have hemoglobin, a molecule which has iron at the center that kind of latches on and carries oxygen. If a person doesn't have enough iron in their diet, then they could have anemia. They might be tired a lot or have low energy. Or there are also genetic diseases like sickle cell, which causes the blood cells to be misshapen, cause them not to carry enough oxygen. Leukemia is a cancer that affects the circulatory system and the immune system because it's a cancer of the bone marrow, the central part of our bones that produce our blood cells. If a person has cancer in that bone marrow, then that can lead to problems creating white blood cells and so forth. Just some diagrams that show some information related to these. Here you have the narrowing of the arteries due to buildup of cholesterol or a blood clot. This diagram, this shows these are the coronary arteries. Okay, they can actually inject a dye into the coronary arteries and then use x-rays and other imaging techniques to see the blood flow through those. And this is how people might know they have a blockage. If you've heard of people talking about somebody's coronary arteries were 80% blocked, and they can tell that by doing this sort of imaging. And then we'll talk about the treatments in a minute. Here you have, healthy arteries versus atherosclerosis, where you have the buildup and the narrowing of those arteries. This is what it looks like when a person has that sickle-cell disease, a genetic disorder. Their red blood cells become misshapen because there's a mutation in the gene that codes for hemoglobin. And they tend to build up and block the flow of blood to different parts of the body. We'll talk more about it as we talk about genetics, but it is a disease of the cardiovascular system. And here you also can see one way that different diseases are diagnosed is by doing a count of the different types of cells in their blood. And elevated levels of certain white blood cells would be indicators sometimes of leukemia. So when a person has a blockage in a coronary artery, it's a little blurry, but there are different techniques that doctors use to help fix those problems. Like we talked about, they can image to see where the blockages are, and they can insert stents or do other things. So the way this is, it works in cardiac catheterization, where they basically take a very thin wire, they insert it into an artery, okay, like the femoral artery here in the hip, and they thread it all the way up through these large arteries of the torso into the aorta, and they can actually feed it through the aorta into those coronary arteries, and they can inject the dye with this tool at the end of the wire to do the imaging. They can also put on the end of that catheter this piece of sort of wire mesh. It's called a stent. And what it does is it goes in an area where there's a buildup, and they have a little balloon at the end of it that they inflate, and it sort of smushes that plaque apart a little bit. The stent expands and kind of locks in place, and then sort of reinforces that area of the blockage so that blood can flow through it more normally. So that would typically, if a person has a coronary artery narrowing, they would try a stent like this first. It's less invasive. They're just putting it in through this wire. If a person needed more extensive treatment, it could do bypass surgery, okay, coronary bypass. And what they do is, for example, in this person's heart on the left, there's a blockage in these two coronary arteries, right? They've been narrowed. Not enough blood is making its way to the heart muscle. Okay, the heart doesn't have enough oxygen, it's not able to work efficiently, and so there is a blockage. So what they do is they actually take veins or arteries from other parts of the body and kind of attach them here. So now what they've done is they've taken this vein, you might have taken it from the person's leg, and they sort of sew it and attach it to the aorta here, and then they bring it down past this blockage and attach it to the coronary artery. So now, as blood goes to the aorta, some of it comes down through this vein and goes around the blockage, supplying the heart with oxygen. Okay. There's another artery here that they can detach from the chest and reattach it here to this other coronary artery. So again, as blood travels up through this artery, some of it comes down and goes around the blockage. And that can reestablish blood flow to the heart, helping a person who has that blockage.